When we get through the all-time best of each team, we get up to Tampa, and you know what always interests me is that Tampa doesn't have any kind of sustained success. You think about the Tampa Bay Lightning right now, what do you think about? You think, well, they had the Stanley Cup in '04, and they've had some good coaches. Cooper's managed to, get some really good years out of them. Tortorella led them to a Stanley Cup. They've had Yzerman as a general manager, did a really good job keeping them under the cap. But prolonged success, that's been elusive. Now, they had a Stanley Cup appearance in 2015, which is kind of easily forgotten, I guess, considering their recent history. And I don't know with this franchise what to say other than the continued success just isn't there, and I'm not sure what it is. I know when I did the series on goaltenders, goaltending has been an issue with this team over the years. It's not right now, clearly. But there have been little issues, I guess, that have kept them out of the playoffs. Their consecutive run from 2003 to '07, 4 years. That's it. That's the longest run they've had in the playoffs in their history. And it is one of the lower numbers on the board. I know Florida, their state rivals, 2. So yeah, I know Florida's 2 is still that's the lowest. Go Florida. So yeah, for Tampa, Marty St Louie, 953 points. It's hard to argue against him being the all-time best of the Tampa Bay Lightning. Stamkos, though, will make that argument. 422 goals, and if I try to make that argument, somebody's going to point out his performance in Game 7s over his career, which is fair. And I think Stamkos would allow for that. St. Louis leads the team in all-time assists with 588. It is a shame. The one thing that I look back on Steve Yzerman's time in Tampa, and I think it's a shame that didn't go another way, is the way that Marty St. Louis' exit happened and unfolded. And I thought that was a shame. I thought it was a shame he didn't get 1,000 points as a member of Tampa and that he played somewhere else. I thought that was too bad. Chris Gratton leads them all time in penalty minutes with 828. So they don't even have anybody with 1,000 in their history, which is indicative of just how low penalty minutes have been. Really, they've been trending in that direction for quite a while. Power play goals, Stamkos, 155, is their all-time leader in power play goals. Not really a surprise there. But again, until Stamkos wins the big one, until we see a cup ring with Stamkos, there are going to be questions about Steven Stamkos. Once he has that cup ring, those questions go away. Now, when we mention the all-time greats, guys who aren't mentioned in the above there, Vinny LeCavalier, who you could argue is one of the greatest they've had. I would put St. Louis ahead of LeCavalier, but it's close. Brad Richards has to be mentioned in that conversation. Nikita Kucherov, and I know he was falling back to normal this year with just roughly, he's only on pace for like about 100 points. Pretty pedestrian compared to the 128 last year, but he has to be mentioned in the all-times. And Victor Hedman. Hedman deserves mention as well, but until they win that Stanley Cup, Hedman is also one of those guys who we're going to see. Does his legacy get affected if they don't win a Stanley Cup with Hedman? Does that affect his legacy as well? We've seen that where players have great careers, and there's that asterisk of, well, they didn't win a Stanley Cup though, so yeah, he had great numbers, but in the big games. And whether it's fair or unfair, in certain players' cases, it's not fair at all. I'm not saying it's fair to Hedman either, but it's there. Vinny Prospal, I got to have him up there. Vinny Prospal in Tampa, it worked really, really well. Vinny Prospal, clearly, he loved playing there. They loved having him there. Now, with goaltending, as I said, goaltending's been an issue for Tampa throughout their existence. Vasilevsky, 153 wins. So Andrei Vasilevsky with 153 wins. Save percentage, Ben Bishop, 921 is their all-time leader in save percentage. I've always been surprised at how much Bishop's moved around since all he's done is put up excellent numbers wherever he's been. I've always been surprised that he's been available. He gets moved and then he gets signed, and I have always waited for a team to commit to him long-term, and then Dallas did it. Shots against, Vasilevsky's actually the leader in shots against with 7,934, which really helps to illustrate how many goaltenders they've had that didn't last very long, didn't stick around. The fact that Vasilevsky is already the all-time leader in both wins and shots against shows that he's a workhorse and that this is a franchise that struggled when it comes to their goaltending. And shutouts, Vasilevsky's number one there with 21 as well. Habib Boulin deserves to be in this conversation when it comes to the greatest goaltenders. I would go with Habib Boulin as probably still the greatest goaltender they've had due to the 0-4 run. And Darren Pupa deserves a lot of credit for being a very solid goaltender for an expansion team that wasn't that great, but they were still better than Ottawa that first year. Am I right? Yes, I am. Ottawa was absolutely miserable. Tampa was not. And Tampa and Ottawa came in after San Jose, so the pickings were a little bit slimmer for them than what San Jose had from the year before. And of course, during their first year, San Jose only had 11 wins. So they were ahead of a couple of teams, probably felt pretty good about themselves as well under the leadership of Phil Esposito. Now, the best team, I had to go with the 03-04 team that won the Stanley Cup. How could I not? Although, talent-wise, I would put the 14-15 Tampa Bay Lightning that went to the finals right there with them. I think it's very, very easy to make the argument for either or. Their most wins as a team during the regular season, Carolina, 63. Points percentage, they like playing Los Angeles Kings, apparently. They have a .683 winning points percentage against the Kings. Goals for, against Florida, they've scored 396. Not a surprise. Probably 40 of those are from this season's first, 8 games of the season it felt like they were against each other. Goals for, being against Florida, but goals for per game, Winnipeg, which used to be Atlanta, 3.26. Not a surprise that Tampa Bay would feast on Atlanta before they moved to Winnipeg. Goals against per game, Columbus, continuing that run of teams from the expansion in the 90s or beyond. Tampa Bay, of course, against Columbus, they only allow 1.97 goals per game against Columbus. They love Columbus. That's what I'm saying. They love playing against Columbus. Put in whatever goaltender's playing against Columbus, good chance they're going to have a pretty darn good night. Now, they don't enjoy playing Columbus in the playoffs. That might be where you put the asterisk on that one as well. I don't think their goals against Columbus includes last year's playoffs. These are regular season numbers. Last year's playoffs, a little bit of an issue for the Tampa Bay Lightning, and likely the fandom don't want me to mention last year's playoffs too much. So when you're mentioning their history, stay out of last year's playoffs as much as possible. This is about their best and not about last year's playoffs when they played Columbus and they got swept in last year's playoffs. So I'm going to try not to mention it. I might have mentioned it a couple of times, but I'm getting into John Cleese mentioning the war territory, so I'm going to move on. Notable captains. That's a Faulty Towers joke for anybody who might be under the age of me. Stamkos, notable captain, of course. St. Louis, LeCavalier, Dave Anderchuk, and Paul Yzerbark was their first ever captain. Paul Yzerbark. So there's a trivia answer right there. First captain of the Tampa Bay Lightning. I like Paul Yzerbark. I was actually kind of surprised he ended up with Tampa and not being in Detroit longer than he did. He was one of those players that I thought, well, he goes to Tampa, he'll score a bunch of points. He kind of sort of did. But of course, those early seasons, Brian Bradley was a good player for them, and he's not on the all-time greats because I wouldn't put him on that level, but he was one of those ones that was like, Vancouver, don't lose. Oh, they lost Bradley. See what he's doing in Tampa. And then people will be like, well, yeah, he's scoring about a point a game in Tampa, but what would he be doing in Vancouver? About a point per game because he's a center and we need one. Anyways, coach, I went with John Tortorella. You can go with Cooper, but I think the playoff setbacks, just the fact Tortorella won the Stanley Cup. 2004 they win the Stanley Cup, and so I'm going with Tortorella. For GM, Jay Feaster was the GM when they won that Stanley Cup, but I kind of feel like Yzerman was the better GM overall. So you can make the argument for either. You can make the argument that Feaster gets him to the Stanley Cup, and so he was the best GM. Or you can make the argument that Steve Yzerman is the best GM, and I can't argue against that. I mean, they don't get to the ultimate goal, but Yzerman manages to keep them under the cap and keep them together, which now that's a job that's going to fall to Brisebois, and we'll see whether or not he's able to maintain that kind of magic. So, in the he was a Bolt category, Bolt being, of course, this right here, the Bolts. I had to wear the Bolts jersey. I was like, I'm going to do Tampa today. I have to wear the Bolts jersey. It has to be Bolts. Just has to. Like tomorrow it's Toronto, so why not wear the Retinas? The Toronto Arenas, but the T's in the middle, so it looks like a Retinas. But yeah, Bolts, there are a lot of guys who've played for Tampa. Very often towards the end of their career, and so there's a number of pretty big names here. Olaf Kolzig, he played a handful of games with Tampa. He did. Basil McRae, one of the toughest players ever in the league's history. He played for Tampa. Michael Nylander, yes. William Nylander's relative did play for the Tampa Bay Lightning. Bill Ranford was a member of the Bolts. Might be easy to forget that Ranford was there, one of the many goaltenders that have come and gone out of Tampa. Gary Roberts. Yep, Gary Roberts played for Tampa, finished his career there. Jonathan Marchessault started out with Tampa. So while we look at Florida and go, what morons, they lost Marchessault. Tampa was the moron first. They had him and let him go to Florida. So, yeah, there were a couple of teams that underrated what Marchessault could do for a team. Craig Janney was a member of the Tampa Bay Lightning, not for a long time, but he was there. Wendell Clark, easy to forget Wendell Clark was a member of the Tampa Bay Lightning. Very, very easy. Mark Recchi, yeah, he was with Tampa. And again, showing that players, as they get older, you got to spend some time in Tampa. You just kind of have to go down there. At least that was the time. That was the point at the time. Matthew Barnaby, he was a member of the Tampa Bay Lightning. We don't see that as much now. You don't see as many of the veteran players going down there now. Not big names, anyways. Dino Ciccarelli, Hall of Famer, was a member of the Tampa Bay Lightning. Denny Savard, who we may remember for being in Chicago and Montreal, and you could be forgiven for forgetting Denny Savard played with the Tampa Bay Lightning. Brian Bellows was with the Lightning. Alex Tanguay was with the Lightning as well for, I believe, just the 1 year. And Matthias Ohlund. I thought about putting Salo up there too, and I thought, nah, it's too many Canucks. But Matthias Ohlund did finish out his career as a member of the Tampa Bay Lightning. I do apologize to Tampa that Vancouver used him up before he went there. Matthias Ohlund going down there kind of reminded me of when Lidster went to the New York Rangers, where the player that the Rangers were getting in Doug Lidster was one that had been worked into the ground by Vancouver. They do that with their defensemen at times, where they just work them into the ground. There's all these injuries nagging them, and they move them. And so they're not going to play a full season, and they're not going to be the player that they were. But Ohlund was one of the best defensemen the Canucks ever had. I know he wasn't in my top 15. I'm aware. The top 100 Canucks is coming at some point. But for Tampa, I thought I'd throw him up there as he was a Bolt name for mention. So there you go. The all-time best of the Bolts. Honestly, that 128-point season they had last year, which was their best, they probably should have won the Cup there. Probably missed out. But they wouldn't be the first team. Detroit comes to mind as one that had, great point seasons and didn't win it. Pittsburgh had fantastic season in 92-93, didn't win it. You've got to be at your best when it counts, and that's where Tampa's had their issues recently. We'll see if they get over that hill, and if we have a different team to put as the best team the next time around that I do this playlist. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And hey, thank you guys so much for all your support during this time. Remember, stay home as much as you can. Make sure your hands are nice and clean and stay safe. All of us are trying to stay safe, and it looks like the numbers are nowhere near as bad as they could have been. And if we're going to keep them down, we just have to make sure we do what we can to maintain things as they are. I know we can do this. I have optimism, and I'll talk to you guys again very soon.